KLM is the oldest airline in the world, still operating today, and several of their crew members were part of a heist, stealing a reported $80 million in uncut diamonds. Or at least that was the impression that the police and the investigators got after they started looking through the security footage at one of the busiest cargo airports in all of Europe, Amsterdam's Schiphol International Airport. There are busier cargo airports in the world, but Amsterdam seems to be the one that I'm most familiar with because I fly there a lot. As a cargo pilot, when you're flying cargo, you don't necessarily know if you're going to be flying a bunch of mail for people or whatever it might be. And so in the times that you're flying stuff that's very high value and very high dollar, like $80 million in diamonds, you may not know about it until you get there. For example, one time I was flying a 747 just like this one that was full to the ceiling with cash. And I had no idea until I really showed up to the plane and started seeing a bunch of police and other things going on and extra people around that it was going to be anything different. Once I started seeing things out of the norm, I asked the loadmaster, who's somebody that handles where all the different boxes go to make sure that our plane's in balance. I said, "What's going on? What are we flying?" And he said, "Oh, it's all cash." And I was like, "It's all cash, like cash money?" He goes, "Yeah." And we were maxed out. So that 747, it was full to the ceiling with cash. People were paying attention to that flight. Now my guess is the pilots were sitting out on their plane because this was scheduled to be a 45-minute flight on a Dutch carrier called Tulip Air Cargo. And I doubt these pilots that were sitting inside had any ideas that they were about to have $80 million of diamonds on there. And as I read this story and heard about it, there were several things that started to catch my attention. One of them being that that airline had already gone out of business, yet they were hired to fly $80 million worth of diamonds. It was just a short flight going from Amsterdam over to Antwerp, Belgium, which is roughly 45 minutes. It's common to have very high value things transported in the air in this type of situation because you remove a lot of the security risk of transporting it on the ground. So by putting it in the air, you have a lot more control over everything. So insurance companies usually prefer, if you're going to transport something like $80 million of diamonds, that you would do it in a secured aircraft. Makes sense. And the more I dug into it, I had a hard time getting some of the details because the Dutch media has done a very good job not releasing a lot of the information about the operation. The first thing that caught my attention is I started looking at what type of aircraft they were going to use for this 45-minute flight. Obviously, you wouldn't want to use a 747. That would be a waste of fuel, even though it'd be way cooler to have like a 747 and just have like one briefcase like stapled down onto the middle of the main deck. But anyways, you wouldn't do that because it'd be a big waste of money. But I started wondering what type of plane were they using, and that also seemed a bit strange. When I searched the fleet type online, I came across a few different pages, but this one said that the only aircraft that this airline had operating was the mighty Jetstream 32. Strangely enough, I used to fly the Jetstream 31 and 32. It's basically the same plane. There's a few minor details which doesn't really matter, but that was a plane that I was familiar with flying, and I thought, oh, okay, interesting. That wouldn't be my first choice to transport something as high value as diamonds. It's a great plane. It's a workhorse. Way back in the day, I told you about a story where I ate a bird when we were landing that went right into the engine, and that Garrett, which is a type of engine, it just chewed that bird up like nothing. So it's a great plane, and it's a great workhorse of a plane, but it wouldn't be a choice that I would make for transporting diamonds. Here's why. On most aircraft, when you transport something of extreme value, you're going to want it to not be accessible to as many people as possible. And the problem is with the Jetstream, there's only one place that you can do that, and that's right here in the belly of the aircraft. And the problem is with the belly of that aircraft is that the fuel on a lot of Jetstreams that I was familiar with, because the way the wings had a pitch to them, a lot of the times the fuel would end up dripping down on the inside of the wings over the course of the flight and dripping into that pod underneath there. So what I had been told by some operators is that they would take all the luggage, because sometimes you would put the passenger's luggage in that belly freight area, in that pod underneath, and they would put them in trash bags. And they'd put them in trash bags, and the passengers wouldn't necessarily see this happening. Their bags would be in trash bags, and then you'd close up that pod, you'd fly it, and then the bags would come out of the trash bags, and the people would have no idea that their bag had been covered with trash bags, and which was covered with little bits of smelling jet fuel that smells kind of like kerosene. So you wouldn't really want to put $80 million in something like that. I wouldn't want to. And for an airline to be an authorized carrier, they need to have the right type of equipment and right type of insurance in order to transport high value things like this. Which is the other reason I thought it was really strange, because the jet stream has not that heavy of a payload capacity. $80 million of diamonds, okay, they absolutely could do that. But what about $80 million of something else, like gold? At the time of the robbery, $80 million in gold, if you were to put it onto a regular container, would be close to 12,000 pounds. Or for the rest of the world who didn't want to come to our super cool system of measuring and weighing things, that'd be like 5,500 kilos. It's a lot, and a lot more than the jet stream would be able to handle. However, they would have been able to handle the $80 million in diamond because it would weigh less than 10 pounds. But these airlines have to negotiate to get the right insurance and the right contracts and know the right people to make these types of deals and have the ability to handle a higher payload than something like the jet stream. The other thing being is the place that you're going to be able to put secure, high-value cargo like that. You're not going to want to take it and put it in a briefcase and just set it and strap it into a seat where there's nobody except two pilots and nobody able to see or hear anything that they're planning to do. I wouldn't want to put $80 million just in a briefcase on a seat right there and just say like, okay, great, I'll see you guys on the other side, which is usually not what happens. Usually when you have something that's very, very high value that has access by the crew, and I know this because I've hauled this type of stuff, you will have what's called a handler. So when you show up to work that day, instead of it just being you and a couple crew members, there's this other guy who's also there who has extra paperwork. So in that case, you would have that handler. He would basically watch the whole loading process come off from the secure truck into the equipment area or wherever they're going to put the stuff on the main deck on my plane, and they would watch this whole process go on. They would watch when the doors closed. Once the doors closed and the main door to the plane is closed, they would come upstairs and they would sit down with us, and there's other stuff, documentation that has to happen and other processes that have to happen, but basically that's the idea. Their whole responsibility is watching it come from that armored truck onto the plane. Once the plane is closed, they're pretty much done until the plane lands. And then once the plane lands, they watch it get off of that plane and somebody else on the other side signs for it. That's one option. The other option is that you have the people on the ground, let's say in Amsterdam, watch it get loaded on the plane. And then there's a person on the other side that receives it and watches it come off of the plane. So you have two people that are taking responsibility on both sides. But in that case, that very sensitive or high value stuff, you're going to want in an area that is not going to have access to for the many different people. So your pilots, you would want to have them have access because now it opens the liability. You'd want to have it, let's say on my plane, you'd want to have it in the belly. No pilots are able to get down there because you can only access it from the ground. So you'd have that handler watch them, close that, he'd watch the whole plane take off, and then the people on the other side would watch the plane land and then come in and park, and then that would be the next time somebody would be accessing that compartment. So they'd have basically no ability for anybody to get it while it's in flight. Makes sense. But they're not going to use a 747 for this flight, and it didn't really make sense to use that plane, so I looked to see if there was any other aircraft that might make sense for them to transport it, and they said that they had a Piper Chieftain, which oddly enough I also used to fly back in the day, and there's really only one place that you'd be able to put that where people wouldn't have access to it while it was in flight, and that's right here. There was these little lockers that we would use back in the day, and we'd put things in there like small stuff. You could easily put $80 million of diamonds in there, but it wouldn't really make sense that you'd want to put that in a locker that could just fly open. It's not a pressurized compartment. The plane isn't pressurized. It's a great plane, and you're going to want to have a dual engine plane. So I looked at the other planes they have. They were all single engine, and most of the times for insurance purposes, they're always going to want to have two engines, especially jet engines or engines that are going to be more reliable, because those jet engines are going to ensure you have the ability to safely fly if you lose one engine to a destination and safely land. I know people get panicked when their engine explodes, and I would too, but the other engine is going to be able to carry you to an airport and able to safely land. Those are the rules that the FAA requires, or all the different countries require, as far as for it to safely get the people or the freight safely to a spot. Makes sense. So we could rule out all the single engine planes, and those seem like the only two realistic planes that they would use for this short of a flight. But it turns out that it wasn't the plane or the crew that was at risk at all of these $80 million in diamonds going away. It was actually before they even got to the plane. There was a crew that was impersonating a KLM crew, and that ground crew that was being impersonated walked up to the people who had the diamonds. And those guys that had the diamonds were sitting there thinking, oh, here's some of our colleagues coming over to talk to us. They didn't think, oh, there was anything suspicious because they looked like KLM crew, dressed like KLM crew, had the badges like KLM crew, looked comfortable as they approached them, so they didn't think anything of it. The problem was, they weren't crew members at all. They were planning a heist. All of this was happening right here in the cargo area of Schiphol Airport. And today when I park my plane at Amsterdam, this is pretty much where I park. And right here is where all the cargo is kept. And logically, it makes sense that if you're going to have cargo coming in and out in large trucks, you're going to want those very close to a freeway because those trucks need to be able to get in easily and get out easily. So when you zoom out from the cargo area here, you notice there are major freeways and roads everywhere. So if you were to steal diamonds right here, all you would have to do is get to here and you'd be able to disappear, which is where this man came into play. And as we get into some of these names, you have to realize we don't have names like this in Texas, so forgive me if you're watching this and you have the same name. This guy's name is, according to me, Earl. And according to the records online, he was one of the masterminds behind all of this. But he got some help from some other people. And this crew, what they did is they stole a KLM branded van that looked exactly like all the other vans at the airport. They made KLM badges, which looked way more realistic than this. And as you can see, this is probably why I failed art class in high school. And then they got an inside man, Ramazan, who got them the uniforms, got them the schedules of when everybody was going to be where, what trucks they would be in, what to look for, and so they knew exactly how to blend in without getting a second look. One of the reasons that you'll see me in uniform if you ever see me at the airport is that I'm able to move through security easier and be able to move through the airport quicker. I'm able to get on the plane easier, faster, without problems. Maybe I have an extra bag, and sometimes people are bag limited, but if I'm in uniform, they just let it slide. So for me, it's a little bit easier, and I like to make my life easy. So I'll wear a uniform. So I'll get through all the different places, and nobody will really question what I'm doing. Well, in the case of this crew, it was the exact same thing. And you might think, oh, I don't know, people would kind of know. That's not true. One time I had a 4-hour sit at an airport and I was going to be flying home and I was bored and it was the middle of the night and I was in Asia and I had nothing to do. So me being bored, I just started wandering around. I started wandering around through this airport with nothing to do and people are just opening doors for me and I'm just busily walking around because if you don't know me and I'm just walking, I look pretty serious and I got my little pilot walk on and I'm just cruising around and people were popping doors open for me and I was just kind of like moving around the airport. There wasn't a lot going on. Well, I eventually ended up in this corner of the airport and I had like an hour and a half before my plane was going to board for me to go home and I thought, oh, I better head back towards my gate. So I start walking back towards the gate and the security guy, I asked him, I said, hey, how do I get over to this gate here? And he goes, we're using Google Translate. He's like, how did you get over here? And I said, I don't know, I just kind of walked over here. He goes, you're not supposed to be, how did you, like he was confused, like, how did you even get over here? I could see the confusion. Then he started talking on the radio and I thought, uh-oh, this probably isn't very good. And because I was going home, we have handlers that get us from our plane to our van and to the airport hotel or wherever we're going to stay. But because I was just staying inside the airport, they left me unsupervised, and so I just started wandering around. And I ended up in this corner of the airport, which I wasn't supposed to be in. Anyways, while I'm sitting there waiting, they ended up bringing some airport handler, not from my airline, over to get me back to the side of the airport where I was supposed to be on. So my point is that in uniform, if you look like you mean business, which apparently I do, they let me kind of go into some places that I wasn't supposed to be in this airport, and I got a handler that got me back in. They weren't upset, but they were kind of confused. So this crew that's impersonating a KLM crew, by dressing and doing all the things and having a chill mannerism, you're able, surprisingly, to get to a lot of places that you really shouldn't get to if the security isn't up to par, which apparently it wasn't. And this crew ended up doing something really strange which surprised me. We're going to get into that in a second. But at this point, Earl and his crew entered the cargo area and they approached this armored car and forced the guards out without firing a shot because their guard was down. They took the diamonds, they put it in their fake, realistic looking KLM van and basically drove it out of the airport and nobody knew where they went because they dropped into these roads and they had no idea which direction they went. Before the police could figure out anything that had happened or where they went, they were gone. And keep in mind, this was just 10 pounds of diamonds that was worth $80 million. So really easy to grab something that small and run and move. And when you're stealing and running a heist, weight matters. $80 million in gold, you're not going to move that fast. 10 pounds? Even I could steal that. Now, remember when I said that they did something that was a little bit strange? Well, police found over $30 million of these $80 million actually just sitting in the van, which they'd used to steal them. I have my own theories of why those diamonds got left behind, but it would just be me guessing, and I'm no jewel thief, so I would just be guessing at something. But what I'll find interesting is that in all the articles that I read, or this entire time when you've been watching this video, I bet none of you thought about these pilots that were still sitting on the plane. Because they were doing such a short flight of only 45 minutes, they probably had no idea what was causing this delay, because obviously the cargo wasn't coming out to the plane. Which means that they were sitting there this entire time, delayed, not knowing what was going on, and because it was just a 45-minute flight, those pilots were snackless. And I don't think Earl or his crew got punished for any of that. When I read the reports, a lot of them got punished for 10 years or less, which seems like a pretty light penalty for stealing $10 million, but because I guess nobody got murdered or hurt, they just let it kind of go, and they never recovered most of those diamonds. The $30 million they found, but the 50 or so million that went missing, and that was $50 million a long time ago, so that's worth a lot more now. And I'm not saying this is a war crime, but they do a lot of the war crime things in the Netherlands, so it does make sense that if there is a retrial, that this maybe get brought up as a point. These poor pilots were stuck there starving. Since this incident happened, the security obviously had to get rearranged completely at Amsterdam International Airport, and they also had to increase the insurance premiums, which exploded after this incident. $80 million going missing is obviously a major problem. Even though they recovered $30 million of it, it's still a big problem to lose $50 million on one afternoon. And for these guys to get caught and only get 10 years is kind of crazy. I have to respect the amount of planning and thought process that went into planning these heists. I guess as somebody that's always planning for every different scenario that could go on a flight, I have to appreciate the amount of planning that they took to plan for all the different possible contingencies. I think it's impressive. I look forward to hearing from you. Until then, keep the blue side up.